Amnesia is one of my favorite games of the last few years and probably my all-time favorite horror game. It was released in 2010 and developed by a small independent team of developers based in Sweden called Frictional Games. Being that I regard Amnesia as highly as I do, I think it almost goes without saying that I really appreciate the developers behind the game as well. The first thing they ever released was a tech demo called Penumbra, which was meant as a demonstration of the engine they built called the HPL engine, named after horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. The setting and story for this brief demo set the groundwork for what would eventually become Penumbra Overture, which was Frictional's first retail release game. What made the HPL engine so cool were the dynamic environments and in the way the player could physically interact with objects such as doors, drawers, and switches. This simple idea actually turned out to be brilliant in just how much it contributed to overall immersion. Having all the desks and cupboards and stuff actually have space inside them gave depth and added a great degree of believability to the environments, and being able to interact with them as such allowed the player to better immerse themselves within them. Upon its release, Penumbra was pretty well received, but the game failed to sell very well. The release of Overture directed some attention toward Frictional, and Paradox Interactive picked up the publishing rights for the sequel Penumbra Black Plague. Black Plague ended up performing better critically and commercially, but the final game in the series, Penumbra Requiem, didn't perform quite as well. Amnesia: The Dark Descent was released a couple years after the Penumbra series wrapped up, and at this point Paradox was no longer Frictional's publisher, so they didn't have much marketing power behind the game when it was first released. The initial sales figures were nothing too special, but the critical consensus was that the game was excellent. They were lucky to have released the game right around the time when the PC game market was really shifting in overwhelming favor of digital distribution, which made self-publishing much easier for independent developers such as Frictional. The style of gameplay that Amnesia had is pretty much the same as what was featured in Penumbra. It's a first-person horror adventure game that doles out alternating scary sequences with environmental logic puzzles. This blend of first-person and adventure is actually incredibly unique considering how well it works in these games. Most adventure games are usually fixed camera third-person or point-and-click style like old LucasArts adventure games or Myst. Although there are plenty of first-person games that do have adventure elements within them, as far as I know there haven't really been any true first-person adventure games. Horror game designers have been spending years finding ways of invoking fear in the player, and it's been understood that imposing vulnerability is a great way to do this. Amnesia was basically just like, fuck this, and jumped to the extreme by taking combat out of the game altogether. Wow, Daniel can't even fight? What a fucking useless bitch. This type of approach is rarely used in games, and an example of this technique being used effectively is seen in the 2005 game Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. Call of Cthulhu is probably the only non-frictional game I've played that comes close to being a true first-person adventure game. In an earlier scene in the game, your character is being chased by a murderous mob through a hotel, and the only way to survive is by running away and frantically locking and barricading doors behind you to stave off the mob.
He's awake in there. I can hear him moving about.
Break the door down, you damn fool!
Quick! I seen him here.
Don't get him your way!
Check the door.
This was probably the most tense gameplay sequence I've ever played in my life. Another example of this is found in the Clock Tower game series, in which the protagonist is forced to occasionally hide from a menacing enemy called the Scissor Man.
What's wrong?
Help! Someone is following me!
Some kind of weirdo?
But in the end, how the presence or lack of combat affects the scariness of a game isn't a black and white issue. The implementation of combat within horror games exists on a spectrum, with Amnesia on one extreme and Dead Space 3 on the other. It's not like not having the ability to fight back in a horror game automatically makes the game super scary. It depends on how it's implemented within the game. In Dead Space 3, you're basically given every bolt in the known universe and a bazillion weapons to blow up the aliens with. Realistically, the Dead Space games, especially Dead Space 2 and especially Dead Space 3, are just action games. The only thing scary about Dead Space 3 was those microtransactions. Heyo! On the other hand, Amnesia has no weapons, but you as a player understand the only thing you can really do is run away and hide from the monsters, which is easy enough if you're prepared. At least with Penumbra, it wasn't blatantly obvious that you weren't supposed to fight the enemies because the game did provide you with the means to fight, and it took a few attempts to realize how retarded and ineffective the combat was.
Ah! Yeah, fuck you! Fuck! Yeah, fuck your shit!
You suck!
Fuck
Look at it! Look at it first!
Fucking get him! No!
Get him!
No! Okay.
Oh, it doesn't work.
But these tense and frantic fights were actually some of the scariest moments within the game because you had to directly face the enemy and come to terms with your lack of power. The struggle of actually trying to fight these enemies creates the kind of tension prevalent in the Condemned games, but largely absent from Amnesia. I was constantly on edge in Condemned because I knew I couldn't just avoid all the enemies. I had no choice but to face them head-on in a melee fight that actually required skillful tactics. A type of tension similar to what we see in Penumbra was generated by the awkward tank-style controls from the older Resident Evil or Silent Hill games. Silent Hill had very clunky melee combat that benefited the games tremendously as you were actually forced to fight most of the game's enemies. Many people consider the Silent Hill games to be some of the scariest ever made. These gameplay design decisions limited the player's versatility, which increased the power of the enemies relative to the player and just generally made the game scarier.
Can't run into straight. Ah! 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 Help me!
These different games have different types of tension that generate different types of horror, so in the end it's kind of pointless to try and rank them in terms of scariness anyway. I really like to think the combat in Penumbra was deliberately awkward just to discourage the player from using it rather than being shittily implemented. In either case, it ended up working in the game's favor. But back to Amnesia. So in Amnesia, you play as a guy named Daniel who awakens at the beginning of the game with a case of amnesia, as the title of the game suggests. Daniel can't even remember anything. God, fucking bitch, what a fucking pussy. This was actually a good story decision in that it imposed a lack of information regarding the protagonist's past on the protagonist, because technically players of any game find themselves in that exact same position when they begin a new game since they don't have the memories of the protagonist's experiences before the beginning of the game, if that makes sense. The original title for this game was actually Amnesia, the Convenient Story Trope. The style of gameplay found in this game as well as Penumbra does an excellent job of displaying the elements of Frictional's truly inspired game design. Keep in mind, Frictional is a very small team of developers and they don't have the same kind of resources a AAA game would have behind it. Their style of game is effective because of how inspired they are as developers. They have well-designed puzzles, good writing, and above all, their games really have heart. You can really tell Penumbra and Amnesia are labors of love by developers who truly love video games and making them. Amnesia also represented a huge technical jump for Frictional. Amnesia had outstanding sound design and really good graphics, and this coupled with an improved overall sense of game design really made Amnesia a much cooler and more effective experience than Penumbra. The bleh noises the monsters made and that weird screaming sound effect as a monster chased you were both unforgettable. The game also functions on the fear of the unknown, that is, the principle that the less you see of something, the more it will scare you. Once you become familiar with an enemy in a horror game, it becomes less scary. You only see Pyramid Head or Nemesis a few times throughout Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil 3, and they scare the shit out of you each time. Stars. It was tough to really get a good look at the Amnesia monsters considering you were always running away from them, and you only see them a few times over the course of the game anyway. Imagine how less scary Amnesia would have been if it regularly had huge rooms with like 50 of the monsters running around in them, and you had a minigun to mow them all down, and it had microtransactions. It would be Dead Space 3. Fuck you, Dead Space 3. Amnesia featured a sanity system which would cause the player character to experience anxiety effects such as blurry vision, reduced looking sensitivity, and even hallucinations when you viewed unsettling things such as monsters or dead bodies. These insanity effects were also triggered by staying in the dark for too long. This created a gameplay feature where the player had to balance the risk of being seen by a monster due to using the lantern or staying in the dark and risking insanity. He's afraid of the dark too? Wow, fucking pussy. Afraid of the dark, you fucking pussy ass bitch. The insanity effects were similar to features in Call of Cthulhu as well as Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem, which was a 2002 GameCube horror game. Of course, the difference here was that Eternal Darkness was really fucking malicious about it. If your character in the game witnessed too many unsettling events and their sanity meter depleted, the game would actually begin to fuck with the player. For example, the player character's limbs would explode or the screen would turn off, making you think the GameCube was disconnected, or you changed the TV input. But yeah, Amnesia. It's awesome. The sanity effects combined with the environmental interaction and immersion thanks to the HPL engine, the unique blend of genres, and the awesome sound design really made it a fantastic game. Amnesia represented a shitload of really good ideas that came together in a very well-executed package. It took a while for Amnesia to really blow up in popularity, but when it hit 200,000 sales 4 months after release, it represented the first time Frictional found themselves in a position of sustainability, which is obviously a very important moment for new developers. After Amnesia received heaps of critical praise, THQ bought the publishing rights for the physical version of the game and inadvertently created one of the stupidest and most unintentionally funny video game covers I've ever seen. So scary. Quack. Amnesia was set to become a relatively underappreciated indie gem, but then something crazy happened. Let's Players on YouTube were making videos of themselves playing this game, and these videos were becoming insanely popular. More popular than any Let's Play videos had ever been.
There'll be enough time.
Bro. We cool.
He escaped. Where is he now?
I don't want to play this game anymore.
My frame rate's working again, and I'm gonna go check.
Oh shit, I have a bag of Milky Way.
Amnesia was quickly becoming infamous for being one of the scariest games ever made, and its sales kept coming in. 10 months after release, the game had reached 350,000 sales. It wasn't until about a year or two after the game's release that these videos really began to blow up. 2 years after release, the game had reached 1.4 million sales. Amnesia was the game that cemented Frictional's spot within the game industry. Its almost viral success spawned a ton of other types of combat-free indie horror games aimed at having the same type of viral success. Slender probably wouldn't have even existed if it wasn't for Amnesia. I still think that Amnesia may be one of the single greatest factors in shifting YouTube toward a predominantly Let's Play video market. Amnesia was the perfect game that evoked extreme reactions from players that really entertained people who view these videos. This type of viral success is exactly what happened with Slender a couple years later, which enhanced the effect on YouTube that Amnesia had. This created a chicken and an egg type scenario. Did Amnesia's popularity turn Let's Plays into a much bigger market, or did Let's Plays make Amnesia as popular as it was? In the end, both of these factors played a role, but what's important to understand is that Amnesia was a very important game for the YouTube gaming community in addition to horror games in general. For their 2013 sequel, Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, Frictional gave developing duties to the Chinese Room, who are most well known for making the game Dear Esther. Now, Machine for Pigs is very divisive, but I still think it's a great game. I know it's got tons of flaws, especially compared to the original Amnesia. They took out the sanity system, your lantern never depleted, the interaction with the environment was severely limited, and most of the puzzles weren't even really puzzles. Despite that, they still absolutely nailed the atmosphere and sound design, and arguably improved them upon the original. And these two traits were some of the most important that Amnesia was lauded for. Still, it did kinda suck to see how the sequel had become less of a game than its predecessor, but overall I still really liked Machine for Pigs. I mean, it's certainly better than Dead Space 3! I really do think Amnesia: The Dark Descent will be used as a standard by which modern horror games will be measured. Slowly but surely we'll be seeing the release of more of these types of games. In the meantime, we can all eagerly await Frictional's next official release, the sci-fi horror game Soma, which is due out in 2015. Please don't get delayed!